Hello everyone, thank you for listening to my presentation on collaborative knowledge production. The title of this presentation is The Naked Truth About Migrants' Views, Service User Participation as Radical Knowledge Production within a Public Welfare Organization. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is user participation in research and participatory knowledge production. What I have been investigating is a case of joint knowledge production between a Swedish authority and this authority's target group. So the organization we'll be looking at is the Swedish Public Employment Office. This is one of Sweden's largest authorities. It's the second largest authority, only outnumbered in employees by the police department. And the PO, besides helping everybody who's unemployed to get closer to the labor market, the PO is also responsible for the introduction for newly arrived migrants in Sweden. They are administrating the so-called establishment program, which is services for newly arrived migrants who has gotten a resident permit in Sweden. And it's this part of the PO that this research is about. So the actual object of study for this research is a 6-month project conducted at the PO at the head office in Stockholm, where they were doing an interview study with participants of the establishment program. And this 6-month project was conducted by a project group of 7 people altogether. 3 employee researchers, but the project group also contained of 4 user researchers. And those 4 people were newly arrived migrants themselves, participating in the establishment program and recruited from the establishment program to join this project group. But these 7 people were conducting this interview study together. And altogether, they collected about 50 interviews interviewing newly arrived migrants. So, to just speak briefly about my empirical material, how have I investigated this? I made recurrent observations throughout the 6 months of the project. I also made recurrent interviews throughout the project. Finally, I also investigated documents, looking a lot at the final report of the project to understand what kind of knowledge is produced within this kind of knowledge production. Looking first at the starting points of the project I investigated, the PO had priorly had several ways of gathering the opinions of service users. But what's new here is that the PO had never done any of these prior investigations had been done in cooperation with the target group or with the service users, but they were always led by employees and carried out by employees. So this was something new within the PO. And the ambition of the project was to create a high level of influence and user control for the user researchers to try to create a distinct user perspective in this knowledge that was produced. So that's the starting points of the project investigated, and my starting points then for my research project. I actually started out with some suspicion due to prior research, because we know from prior research that in collaborative research designs, even though the ambition is to share responsibility, share control and create user influence, still we know that a lot of times at least the professional researchers still maintain the vital control of the project. They still make the vital decisions of the project. So what I wanted to investigate then was 2 things actually. I wanted to investigate the distribution of control in the project between user researchers and employee researchers. And I wanted to investigate the character of the knowledge produced. What kind of knowledge is produced in this kind of joint knowledge production? All right, jumping then to the findings of my study, talking first then about the distribution of control. I was actually quite surprised because the employee researchers did actually manage to create quite large space within the authority where the user researchers could actually work quite freely and control the project to a quite high degree. And as you can see here on the slide, I highlight that it's the employee researchers who managed to create this space. And this is to recognize the power imbalance in this project, because it's always up to the employee researchers to either enable user control or on the other hand restrict user control. But they actually managed in this project to create this quite high degree of user control. And how did they manage to do that then? Well, I've seen at least 4 ways that made this possible. And the first way was the open-ended character of the project plan. The project plan had been written priorly to the project started by the employee researchers, but it was very open-ended and not planned in detail. And that made it possible to, when the project started, that enabled the user researchers to actually get quite a lot of influence on how the details of the project should be mapped out. The second way to create this possibility for user control was that the employee researchers actively assigned strategically important decision making to the user researchers. Repeatedly, when decisions were supposed to be made, they told the user researchers that this is decisions that you have to make. We can't make these decisions in the project. So that's the second point there. The third point was about the employee researchers disregarding their own preferences in this project. The employee researchers, of course, also had a lot of ideas about what this project should be about, how it should be carried out. But repeatedly, if their preferences clashed with the preferences or the ideas of the user researchers, the employee researchers usually took a step back and said, okay, if this is what you want to investigate, then this is what we will investigate in this project. So that's another point making it possible to create this user control in the project. And the fourth point then was that the employee researchers made repeatedly conscious maneuvers to prevent organizational influence on the user researchers. And we can see here just one example of such a maneuver, preventing organizational influence. Yeah, so you can see here that the project actually declines help from quite prominent or educated researchers at the research unit because they don't want them to affect the content of the analysis. So if you look now more generally at the distribution of control in the project, you can see that within this project you could see that there were some parts where there were less professional leadership and more user control, and other parts where there were more professional leadership and less user control. What to govern and how to govern this kind of projects. And the parts with less professional leadership and more user control was concerning formulating research focus, themes for the interviews and the interview questions. Also conducting all the interviews on the native language of the interviewees. And also when it comes to interpreting the empirical material. So all those kind of issues that concern the content of the study is they have more user control. But then if you look on the other side, there was more professional leadership as well, and that concerned practical issues on methodology, selection, and how to gather data, also on analytical method, not how to interpret it, but how to actually conduct an analysis. How do you do that? Like the craftsmanship of research, and also on the design and structure of publications. So I think this divide shows that on the one hand you have the expertise of the professional researchers, and on the other hand you have the expertise of the users knowing what's interesting to investigate. Looking then at the character of the knowledge produced, you could see that there was a highly if you look at the final report of the project, there was a highly unconventional knowledge that was produced in this institutional setting compared to other studies within the PEO studying user perspectives. And how was it different? Well, for one thing, the format was radically different from other project reports from the PEO, because this report had a very distinct narrative approach with vivid accounts of the users' stories that they told about coming to Sweden, about meeting the PEO, while other reports from the PEO usually just show statistics or show a very formalized presentation of facts. And secondly, the report also had a distinct user perspective instead of an organizational perspective. What I mean about that is that if you look at the other studies conducted, they focus solely on the present services of the PEO, what the PEO are doing right now. But this study had a much more broad focus, because this study actually focused the needs of the migrant, not only what services are provided for migrants. The study shows, and the report shows, that the problem with integration or coming as a migrant to Sweden is not only the delivery of the present services of the PEO, but rather perhaps a need for totally other services that doesn't exist. If you take all of this together, I've called this a radical knowledge production. What do I mean by that? Well, when this report from the project was finalized, the PEO management proved very reluctant to publish this report or disseminate the report. Even within the own organization, they wanted to keep it at this department at the head office where it's been created, because they thought the content of the report was so sensitive in a sense. So what this shows is that successful user involvement in research and in knowledge production could actually challenge the dominant organizational logics, because they show a different perspective. But after a while, after more than 8 months after the report had been finalized, it was actually made official by the PEO. But now the report included 5 new pages that wasn't there to begin with, accounting for the organizational perspective, commenting each section of the report, each topic that the users had put forward in the report were now commented by the PEO in this official version of the report. So what this shows is that it's very, very difficult within a public authority or a public organization to let user perspective speak on their own behalf. And still you can see, even now when the report is official, it's okay to disseminate it, but still the report hasn't been publicly presented, it hasn't gotten a press release, and it hasn't also been published on the PEO database online, where they publish all the PEO reports. So you can still see that there is a reluctance to disseminate or get this kind of knowledge out, the knowledge of the migrants' views. So that's why I've called it a radical knowledge within this institutional setting. Thank you very much for listening. This is my contact information if you would like to contact me. Thank you.